Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker, and I'm very excited about the guests I have on today. Actually, a few weeks ago, we were communicating to each other via Reddit, a post that I found very interesting about the rise of Christian nationalism and its potential conflict, or future conflicts or current conflicts with the members and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Greg Graf, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
You actually have a great little website here that I want to share with the audience here. I want you Greg is actually very much involved in the political scene in the state of Idaho, and he has this website called Political Potatoes, and it really is interesting. And I just want to highlight here, like for instance, here's Doug Wilson of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, and he is a leader in the what you could say the Christian nationalist movement. And it's a great, and he also has a great podcast as well, Political Potatoes. So I just want to encourage people to check out the resources that he has made available. And I think it's really interesting. Like people are like, well, what do you want to talk to some political junkie, in Idaho? Well, first of all, Idaho is a very important state. A lot of interesting things are happening. It also has a substantial LDS population, but you also have the growth of Christian nationalism happening, whether it's from the evangelical world or even from ultra-conservative traditional Catholics who are also very involved in this space. Now, of course, inevitably, you might have conflicts when you have Catholics, Latter-day Saints, and evangelical Christian nationalists all in this kind of interesting mix going on in the state of Idaho. So I think it's really important to see what's happening in Idaho is a preview of what we're going to probably see in the rest of the country as well. And Greg has been kind of one of those people who's been a bit of a whistleblower. Greg, you've been involved in Republican politics for a very, very long time, and not too long ago, you started getting a little concerned about some developments you've seen happening in your party, and also what potential problems that it could have for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I just wanted to kind of open up this platform for you to kind of tell this interesting story.
Certainly. So I've been involved, deeply involved, probably the last 5 or 6 years, but on the periphery and helping candidates and behind the scenes for many more years than that. What's interesting is I helped a number of LDS legislators or now legislators help win races in across the state, specifically in Eastern Idaho, which is where you have the largest population of members of the LDS faith. Is that area that, and then south central Idaho towards Twin Falls. Boise area has a lot, but then as you head further north in Idaho, because if you think about the shape of Idaho, it's got the panhandle. You see more as you head towards North Idaho. A lot of interesting factors at play because historically speaking, the Idaho Panhandle has a long history, right? That's where Richard Butler of the Aryan Nations had his stronghold, his base. You had there was that movie, The Order, that just came out. That talks about the first group, Richard with Richard Butler's connections there that were knocking off banks and armored cars and things like that. And they're the ones who killed that radio station host in Denver, et cetera. So,
Yeah.
by the way, highly recommend that movie, Jude Law movie, The Order. That really delves into a little bit of the history, but there's a long, long history of this redoubt, patriot, Christian nationalist, white supremacy movement in North Idaho.
Hmm.
That doesn't, it's not the same as the rest of the state. That's just that particular portion. But politically speaking, those factions in North Idaho have gained a stronghold, and working with other people across the state, I would say a minority, a small bloc, has taken control of the Idaho GOP. Now, this is probably something you've seen in states like Utah and other places where your patriot or more, they would call themselves more conservative movement, um, has taken over from traditional Republicans. And so you have moderate traditional Republicans who are, you know, an Idaho Republican going back 10 years ago, compared to a Republican from California would be very different, right? You'd see someone from a California Republican as pretty really more liberal than a Republican in Idaho. You would say, well, that's a pretty strong conservative. But you saw an influx of people moving from California, Oregon, and Washington to the tune of 70% of all the new people moving into Idaho registered and identified as Republicans. but very conservative Republicans, you would say more mega Republicans. And that's fine. I mean, Idaho went Trump, what, 60, 70%? I mean, it was
Just real quick
rare.
too, Greg,
Yeah.
it's interesting because we have a similar thing happening here in Florida where you
Yeah.
have a bunch of people who basically fled from blue states and came to Florida and made Florida from being a swing state to
Hmm.
dark red uh,
Yes.
state. And it is definitely a Trump state as well. So we're seeing a similar dynamic happening nationwide.
Right, right. So people are migrating to where they feel like they're more accepted, right? They're where their politics are more accepted. The challenge we saw in Idaho is you have a lot of multi-generation Idahoans been here forever. People have been here like me for over a decade. See this recent influx. It was really during the COVID years that this started happening. House prices, they were able to sell their home for a lot of money in California, buy something for cheap in Idaho, which of course raised property values here, like shot up overnight. And Idaho became, I think, the second fastest growing state in the country. One of the first or seconds. It was crazy the amount of growth we had here. Anyway, as a result, it shifted the political spectrum over to where these groups that had been working for over a decade and trying to push the state further right suddenly had a new base of voters and support coming in. They would actively go out and recruit as soon as they'd see new addresses pop up, invite them to Facebook groups, things like this. Um, and really delved into, and this is also a lot of the churches, right? They were looking at recruiting new people coming in from California, and a lot of them were um, more evangelical leaning. Not, I wouldn't say they were Christian nationalists per se, um, but they liked the idea of nationalism and this idea of God and country, right? The cross and the flag, not recognizing that that's going down another path. And so we saw a lot of exploitation of that here, which led to groups from out of state, like Young Americans for Liberty and others, dumping in a lot of money to getting handpicked, and I would say a lot of more Christian nationalist candidates elected into office to try to take control of the state legislature. Now, they don't have a majority, right? They have a fractional piece, but Idaho being a deep red state, the vast majority, we have a supermajority of Republicans in the House and the Senate. But they took enough seats now to swing it over where they have enough influence to control or push their agenda within the legislation. Okay. Where this starts becoming an issue is instead of focusing on, you know, I don't know, I think there's a bill right now for getting digital driver's license like they have in Utah. Okay. That makes sense, right? That's a practical solution. Or focusing on funding, repairing and building our roads and infrastructure. The first thing out of the gate is you have a legislator by the name of Heather Scott, who's a longtime Christian nationalist, uh, wanting to run a bill to ban gay marriage, right? To have Trump revisit and override the Supreme Court's decision on marriage equality. Number one issue for them. And so what we're seeing is this culture war happening, led by this group that is deeply devoted and pushing these Christian nationalist ideas. Now, as a result, you're seeing, I would say, I mean, there's this really interesting fight going on. A large percentage of legislators in Idaho are LDS, especially from East Idaho and other places. As a result, they're being pulled in directions that are really interesting. Like, for instance, Idaho, what I would say is the far right, is they're really pushing this idea of laws on abortion. Now, I'm pro-life. Most people are, and most members of the LDS faith, including the, I believe, church leadership, has come out and said that there are they're okay with some exceptions, right? Abortion is, seen as immoral, like as a convenient or an act of, a voluntary thing done, voluntary act, is seen as wrong. Okay. And I think a lot of people or most people agree with, yeah, we don't really want abortion. It's not a great thing. But in the case of life of the mother, incest, rape, things like that, right? Or where they have ectopic pregnancies where, this is of no fault of the mother, right?
Mhm.
This particular pregnancy could actually kill the mother, if not managed. They were pushing for bills that would criminalize those exceptions. Okay,
Right.
so no abortion whatsoever. And as a result of the legislation passed, I've spoken to many people where I spoke to one person recently whose daughter went to, she found out she was pregnant, thought she had was having severe pain, went to the doctor and they said, well, they called it a tumor, right? Said, and it was like it had swelled up to the size of, about a couple inches. It was rather large and potentially life-threatening. They gave her some pain medication, sent her home. It's like, oh, it's fine. We'll schedule, you just we'll manage it. They didn't do anything, right? And this was in Moscow, Idaho. So she called her dad and he says, go, I'll pay for you. Just go to Washington right now. Go to the hospital. They'll go to the emergency room. And she went and they got her into emergency surgery because it was an ectopic pregnancy. They thought they had misdiagnosed it as a tumor.
Oh,
Um,
okay. So
but they
okay, so
didn't
that
misdiagnose it. They intentionally sent her home because the
oh,
laws in Idaho, the doctors are so afraid of doing anything that they could be criminally prosecuted or lose their license, their medical licenses, that they
okay.
actually send them away. Like, sorry, we can't help you.
So they
Okay.
didn't even tell her that that she was pregnant. They just I mean,
They said
they
it was a
just
tumor.
it was a
Yeah.
tumor. Oh, wow. Interesting. Okay,
And so
that's
she had to get an emergency surgery because had it progressed, she would have bled out. Like it would have burst. It would have been a huge, like it could have killed her. Right. I have talked to other people who have said that they're spending up to $80,000 on life flights, right? So if they have a pregnancy where there's a medical emergency, um, and the doctor's like, we cannot help you here. We legally cannot. You will bleed out, you will die here, and we cannot do anything because of the laws. So you have to get on a life flight and go down to Nevada or Oregon or Utah, whatever is closest here, and spend $80,000 on this helicopter flight, which, by the way, the insurance companies won't pay for because they can't pre-authorize or pre-approve the expense because it's an emergency situation. So these women, at no fault of their own, who are not seeking an abortion, are having to go into debt for $80,000 for a life flight because certain individuals in Idaho want to push an extreme religious agenda that does not coincide with other religious groups, other Christians, like members of the LDS faith. And they want to enforce their ideological agenda on everyone else. And it's actually hurting people, right? So this is why I look at some of these issues. I'm like, we have a problem in Idaho. And and then so what's interesting is some of the LDS legislators voted for these bills. Okay. Now, normally they wouldn't, but this is before the Supreme Court ruling that made it so abortion could be criminalized or blocked in all the states, um, or any state that wanted to. Okay. They opened the door, overturned Roe v. Wade. They didn't know that was going to happen. So they signed on to a bill because the far right Christian nationalist groups, there was one in particular called the Idaho Family Policy Center, which has ties to Doug Wilson of Christ Church in Moscow, right? All the board members are members of Kirk congregations and ordained pastors of his group. And the employees of that group, or they're paid for, or have direct links to Doug Wilson and the Christ Church. So what they're doing is they're applying pressure as a lobbying group on legislators, saying if you don't vote for this bill, we're going to go knock door to door and tell everyone you're not a Christian. Okay, they would literally label a legislator with that threat, and you know what? They followed up on it. So a lot of LDS legislators when they were running for reelection, were up against the Christian nationalists who had the money and resources to fly in out of state people that were going with literature door to door, saying, "Don't vote for this person; they're not a Christian." And that doesn't feel right. And so it's a sneaky way to do it, but that's happening, and that's part of the problem.
so
That's
basically just so people understand is basically there's a lot of pressure put on these legislators that if you do not back our agenda, you will be primaried.
yes,
And And in this case, you've had Christian nationalists unseat Latter-day Saint uh,
Yes.
legislatures. I just want to so people understand what's going on here. And it gets to the point where because the Republican electorate tends to be more conservative, right? And so often
Mhm.
in a primary election in general tends to bring out the activists that basically it becomes who's the most right wing, who's the most
Right.
conservative candidate running. And so if they can frame it in such a way that makes the person who is a conservative but make them into a rhino or not really a Christian or any number of things, this can be very effective when it's in a small electorate, in a
Yeah.
Republican primary. So that's I think it's really important. I also want you just to kind of talk. We brought up Doug Wilson, and
Mhm.
so maybe just explain to the audience who is Doug Wilson. I think it's really important to kind of get some background on that.
So I did a podcast recently with someone named Heath Drusen. He's a reporter, did work for NPR and a number of other outlets. It's one of the top podcasts right now called Extremely American. And he did a series where he interviewed Wilson and others. And what Wilson is he runs what's called Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, which you would think some congregation in Moscow, not a big deal. Why does that have any impact on anything else? Well, he runs something called Canon Press, which if you're LDS, you would think of like Deseret Book. So think about Deseret Book of Christian nationalism spread nationwide. Okay. It is a very large publishing house that publishes materials that many Christians find maybe a little or, a little too far sometimes. And so you're seeing this split between this one particular pastor and his congregation at odds with a lot of other Christians and evangelicals and you think about the Methodists and other groups, right? Episcopalians, I think, are not fans of Christian nationalism, and he has spread his work, through satellite churches and seed churches. In fact, that's their plan. And in his teachings, he talks about building an army, right? Using children, educating them through their private schools that they have, the Logos schools or Lego schools, um, where they indoctrinate them with their teachings, you know, uh, Pastor Wilson's teachings, and from there, they're building this evangelical army of that they would use to, spread their. It's not just spread their message and to grow their church, but they actually actively talk about taking over government.
Yes, and I think
Um,
it's really important for people to understand too that this is part of the dominionist theonomy movement, Christian Reconstructionism.
mhm.
This is what inspired the book, The Handmaid's Tale, was this movement that's part of this whole thing. So I think it's really important to understand this has been a movement that's around for decades. As a matter of fact, I was for a while attached to this movement as a young man. And so I'm very familiar with Doug Wilson. He also comes from a real neo-Calvinist, reformed position, very, very right wing in that sense. And so this is the idea is that within their post-millennial worldview, they essentially believe that we're not waiting for Jesus to return. We got to take over before he returns. And so it's setting up this whole idea of what's going also happening with the New Apostolic Reformation movement, all these things that are happening, and it's growing. It's become very influential in the GOP in general.
Yes, that is a great succinct way of saying it. So groups like this have a lot of resources too, and they're not afraid to use it. In that podcast I did, we played some clips, and one of them was you had Gabriel Wrench. They run a podcast thing called Cross Politics. So cross as in the cross and politics. So they're blending politics and their religion together in a podcast series and using this idea that you have to use their Christian principles embedded into the political space to gain power and to gain, as you said, dominion over others, right? You can't affect change unless you can change the laws. And you can do that by getting enough people elected or getting people, voters to vote for your guy or woman to be elected, usually. So one of the quotes they're saying is, I mean, Drusen, who's Jewish, was interviewing this guy, and he says, I think he interviewed Webben, Joel Webben, was that his name? He's another pastor out of, I can't remember, Tennessee or Kentucky, somewhere over there, part of this same network,
Okay.
and he's very outspoken, and he told him that, um, only Christians should be allowed to run for office.
Mhm.
And he's like, wait, but I'm Jewish. So how does that work? He's like, well, you don't have the right worldview. I don't think you should be able to, basically, we want to exclude anyone who is not like us.
Mhm.
Now, I'm not saying that Doug Wilson's group specifically is anti-Semitic or white supremacist or whatever, but we are seeing that those ties from groups like this, that ideology spreading amongst people who actually are very publicly and outspokenly pushing white nationalism t tied to religion, right? So you see a religious fervor or religious ideologies, this dominionist thinking tied to white supremacy. And that is actually something we're seeing growing in Idaho, and it's becoming a pretty significant problem. So let me give you an example. There was an individual who was a promoter of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. Hey, we all remember that incident where a woman was run over by a car by one of the alt right activists. Anyway, this guy who, in fact, they leaked their Signal or their Telegram group messages because this guy apparently pissed off one of the other organizers. Turns out this guy actually not only was he promoting it on his dad's radio station, he was there present. There's pictures of him like helping organize. He's wearing a little green and white Identity Europa pin, which is as many have identified as a former neo-Nazi group based in Europe. And he was actually responsible to the group for helping them come up with the idea of bringing the tiki torches. Okay.
Mhm.
The guy's name is Dave Reilly. Now, he goes on after that. He loses his job because people are picketing outside his dad's radio station. Like, this is not okay. Like, this guy's a bad dude. Uh, Um, oh, you're putting yes. Yeah, here we go. This is a website showing some of his deleted tweets. This is Dave Reilly. Uh, Someone put together, and actually an organization I work with helped with this, scraping 5,000 of the tweets he deleted, and some of them are just, I mean, he's talking about memes of the Holocaust, right? And for him, someone like him, it's not that the Holocaust didn't happen, is to them they believe it didn't go far enough, right? They
Mhm.
talk about how many people can you bake in ovens like their cookies during X period of time, like the math to them doesn't add up, things like this. It's pretty insane. So this guy moves to Idaho after really pushing this culture war idea. He's part of, as you mentioned before, it's not just evangelicals in Doug Wilson's Christ Church. He's part of what's called the Society of St. Pius X, or SSPX. And you're seeing the second largest group of SSPX is now in North Idaho, just north of Coeur d'Alene. I want to say it's near Post Falls. They have a school, children's school or K through 12 school now, and they're on churches and a fairly decent sized congregation that's growing outside. I think the largest I think is in Kansas City, and a lot of them are migrating or moving towards North Idaho. So they're growing and they're recruiting. And he does a podcast, and I think there was a podcast recently where he's talking about, hey, we talking about birth rates, right? The only two religions that are having the most babies are Catholics and Mormons. He's like, in the next civil war, it's going to be a war between the Catholics and Mormons,
Mm.
uh,
Yeah.
which is, and it's in Idaho, right?
Mhm.
This is the next war. This is the next battlefront. And of course, he's often spouting off his hatreds towards Jewish people, his anti-Israel stance, and other things. But now normally you just write this person off as, oh, he's just a
Right.
kook. He's just some weird guy on the internet spouting conspiracy theories and anti a weird anti-Semite. Well, here's the thing: he was hired to be the media, the communications and media guy for the largest conservative organization called the Idaho Freedom Foundation. He's done work for the Idaho GOP. He currently does work, or has, as far we can tell, done work for the Kootenai County, which is Coeur d'Alene, North Idaho area, um, Republican Central Committee. He has deeply embedded himself within Republican Party politics to the point that he goes to all the conventions. He's a delegate. He helps elect Dorothy Moon, the chair of the Idaho GOP. And they use his help. They appreciate and welcome his help. It wasn't until some reporters found out the connection that he had been working for the Freedom Foundation after one of their insiders had leaked. I guess there's always some internal struggles with these guys, and it got leaked that he was working for them. And so he was quietly, and I mean quietly, they didn't even say he was fired or let go, until months later when a reporter asked, like, oh, he worked for you guys. Like, well, no, he doesn't. You're an idiot. Like, he doesn't work for us. Like, well, you didn't tell us. You got to tell when we ask, you got to answer the questions. You just can't ignore and then act like we don't, we should know better. And that gets to this idea. So you have individuals like this who are having a not just an outsized role in shaping policy and media narratives and helping prop up this far right movement. They're welcomed. And for a lot of Idahoans, once again, people have been here for decades or people have been here multi-generation, they look at that and they said, this isn't Idaho. This isn't who we are. And they're frustrated by these people who moved here from out of state, bringing their ideas with them. And they're actively saying, we want to change, we want to save Idaho from Idahoans. And if you think about it, why did they move to Idaho? Well, Idaho is one of the most conservative states in the country, right?
Mhm.
For decades, for the last 20, 30 years, Republican legislators and governors have helped shape and craft policies to turn Idaho into this great conservative, freedom-loving bastion where, we have a lot of freedom here, right? I think we're the second most gun-friendly state in the nation. Like I'm a huge Second Amendment guy. Like I love the freedoms we have in Idaho. So why do we need to be saved from ourselves, right? We create, a lot of these people help create this conservative state that others thought, oh, I'm going to flee here away from California leftist policies. They call themselves political refugees and move here. Like, well, we want to come here, but then suddenly they want to change it.
Right. Yeah.
And
Well,
we're the rhinos.
yeah, so that's the thing that we all have to be aware of is that there are many principled conservative organizations out there that historically have been honestly really good and done good policy. And this is not just happening in Idaho, but you're seeing, organizations have been around for a long period of time that are being hijacked by people on the far, far right.
Mhm.
And so we have to be aware of this, that this is happening. And then in many ways, it's kind of happened to what we've seen with the hijacking of a lot of the squad and stuff in the
Yes.
Democrat Party. So we're seeing a similar thing. We're seeing like these extremes on both sides of the aisle really pulling us all apart. And everything becomes a litmus test. Like I said, in a Republican primary, you don't need a whole lot of, there's not huge amounts of turnout. So you just need your activists to be out there. And essentially, that's what's happening in both the Republican and Democrat Party, where the extreme elements are taking control, even though they don't maybe necessarily represent a majority. But when you frame it in such a way, well, I'm the true conservative, and anything that deviates at all, you're a rhino, you're a leftist, even if it means you have to then support a total ban of abortion, including saving the life of the mother. I mean, that's pretty extreme by most people's standards.
So on that note, we're now seeing this push uh, for what we call purity tests.
Yes.
And in Idaho, in the Idaho Republican Party, they're passing rules because they've taken over the committees, they've taken over the leadership, they've taken over multiple central committees, so they can get the people there to vote for the resolutions and rules that they want to pass, including rules that allow the local county legislative district chairs to hold what we would call a purity or court, right? Where they can drag a legislator before them, a tribunal. Actually, I think that's what they're being referred to as a tribunal, and then present evidence. And it's kind of a kangaroo court. Like and this has happened multiple times, and it was targeting specifically LDS legislators in Eastern Idaho. Okay, were targeted with this. And they said, okay, here is the Idaho GOP platform. Okay, now if it's just the platform, that's one thing. You did not adhere to the Republican platform. Therefore, and you voted for these bills that the Idaho Freedom Foundation scored negatively and the Idaho Family Policy Center scored negatively. So they're literally utilizing Christian nationalist talking points and groups that have technically nothing to do with the party to use as evidence against a legislator to say, you're a rhino. You didn't follow what we told you to do. Therefore, you need to be censured. And they wanted to go so far as to say that if we censure you, you cannot, when you run for reelection, run as a Republican. Okay, so it's like, nope, you can't even put the R by your name on the ballot. They wanted to change how the ballot was affected. Now, of course, legally there was a lot of problems with that. The Secretary of State was like, no, we're not honoring that. That doesn't go follow state code or the state constitution. You can't do that. But they really, really pushed for that. And as a result, these purity tests backfired. And not only did those legislators get elected, but the central committee, the people over that county, were all ousted, right? Normal that went too far. Normal people like Republicans, like, no, no, that's not us, guys. That is too far. You're out of here. And that was a great example where people there was enough education because this made enough noise in the local media. A lot of people were sharing this on social media that that community rose up. Was like, this is not okay, especially because they went after LDS legislators in a high LDS population area, like, and we're talking Rexburg, right? That's where BYU Idaho is, and Idaho Falls, which is Bonneville County. So that didn't fly there. And so I think that was probably a bad area to do their test case. Maybe if they had done it in North Idaho, they would have been more successful and less backlash. But as a result of this, it sends a chilling effect. It's that we will take power and we will punish you if you don't do what we want. And we throw around these words like extremism, right? We say far right, whatever. And one of the words I say is extremism. And I get a lot of flack for this from people like, well, you can't call me an extremist, right? You're going to put me on an FBI watch list if you do that. That's their thinking. Say, well, no, let's actually, and one of the, if you, in on my Political Potatoes website, there's an article there called where I define extremism in Idaho. And it's not that what you believe or your ideology in itself is extreme. Okay. For instance, you could believe in flat earth theory. Okay. That's outside the Overton window, right? Most people are like, no, I've been in an airplane. I've seen the curvature of the earth, right? We've seen pictures from space, live video from the space station. We've seen Elon Musk's Starship rockets up in space live showing the curvature of the earth, right? We know the earth is not flat, but okay, you can believe that. That in itself does not make you an extremist. Your idea, your belief system is not in itself what makes one an extremist. It can be weird, it can be kooky, it can be outside what normal people believe. Okay, that's fine. What makes someone an extremist is when you are so inflexible in that ideology that you refuse to listen to any argument and that you would go so far as to be abusive towards other people to enforce your ideology. It's that enforcement and abuse of your ideology, regardless of what that ideology is, that makes one an extremist. That's why there are far left extremists. There are far right extremists. It has nothing to do with what you believe in, but what you're willing to do to enforce it. And so when I use the term extremist, I'm specifically talking about people who engage in abusive tactics, coercive tactics, confrontational politics tactics, to get their way.
I think that's a really important way to describe it. I think that, again, it's not about going after people and their beliefs. It's how those beliefs animate you. And if you, look, I know somebody that's a flat earther. And that's
Yeah,
okay, fine. You're kind of weird, but that's okay. But then if he decided to attack people or try to ruin people's lives or their livelihood for not accepting the fact that you're not a believer in the flat earth, that's a different story. I think that's a really good way to
right.
differentiate. We talked about that on the phone. I thought that was a really good point that you made. And so that's what you're dealing with now. Keep in mind here, you've got Doug Wilson, who his organization openly teaches that Mormons are not Christians. You have the Reilly guy tied up with this Catholic group that basically says the next civil war is going to be between Catholics and Latter-day Saints. So here you have these what you could call hostile factions in Idaho that are hostile to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its members. And so I think it's really important that we get this message out there that this is happening. In one sense, it's my people from the evangelical world that are part of the problem here. And I think it's really important that I want to get this across. This is happening. If you're a Latter-day Saint in Idaho, be aware that there are going to be people that are going to try to disenfranchise you if they get their way. And I think it's really important we stand up for religious liberty, having your own conscience on your own views, and not to have them dictated by these outside groups, these pressure groups. I mean, that's is that kind of how you're seeing this whole thing playing out?
Absolutely. And and it's history repeating itself, right? The members of the LDS faith are not um strangers to
Yes.
persecution, right? There's
Yeah.
a lot of history. And I think I brought this up in one article, I think which you found is what brought us together for this podcast. I wrote an article called the Idaho GOP's Unholy Alliance with Christian Nationalists. And one of the things I talk about was, I mean, you have a tweet from the number two guy from the Idaho Family Policy Center. He says, this guy, Titus Folks, says, I think this is one of the most profound things my wife shared with me. When she was a new Christian, several LDS missionaries started visiting with her. They were friendly, Christian, and she started to view them as friends. That is until she started to research the religion for herself. She told me that she became angry when she realized it was an entirely different religion. End quote. She said, they tried to take Jesus away from me. Um, and so they're publicly saying this, right? This is openly hostile to the LDS faith. And if you go back, you know, eight the there was a back when Idaho was a territory, right? As Mormons, or as we know, LDS members migrated to Idaho, Utah, and then Idaho, right? Idaho very shortly after they were as they were spreading in the American West. There was a law that was passed that required those running for office to take what's called the Idaho Test Oath. Okay. And this was not repealed until 1982. So if we think about the extermination order in Missouri, right, it lasted for over 100 years. This was in the 1850s or so, and it actually had they brought it forth the Idaho Supreme Court. They tried to argue against it, and what it did is it meant you had to take a test. Like they'd ask you these questions. It was a purity test. And the point of it was to ask specific questions about tenets of the LDS faith that if you followed these tenets, now some of them had to do with polygamy at the time, and that was part of this what initiated it, but was to say that if you adhere to any of the things, these specific things of your faith, then you cannot run for office in Idaho. You can't be a precinct committeeman. You can't be a mayor. You can't be a city councilman. You can't be in the state legislature or anything else. So they were excluding one religion by law. Okay. This is what they're trying to get back to. And so this is my concern is it's history repeating itself. I don't believe anyone should be excluded and have their freedom and liberties removed based on what they believe and
Well,
their ability to run for office.
Greg, you've pointed out to me that there actually are Latter-day Saints that are involved in these organizations as well. So it's not just, that they're with the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Yeah. And so even though you have like anti-LDS people, you do have Latter-day Saints that are also part of these organizations as well. I think it's important that we get that out too.
Well, and that's actually a really interesting point. And so there's this one thing that really irks me is when I see very hypocritical behavior. Okay. You have an organization. Okay. The Idaho Freedom Foundation in itself was not anti-LDS. In fact, a few of its board members and employees for a long time were and are tout them to be active members of the LDS faith and their donors. And so they were pushing, and they were considered a libertarian organization for a long time. But it wasn't until very recently when the president of the organization, Wayne Hoffman, who was Jewish, left to live in the state of Washington and go on this interesting journey where he's pushing, like, anyway, another thing, hallucinogenic drugs as therapy. Um, that this group, now run by a former BYU economics professor, has aligned itself because of funding reasons mostly. So they go where the money is. They say they're a principled organization, but at the end of the day, they're going to go with whoever was going to foot their bills. And so we're seeing groups like the Idaho Family Policy Center link arms with them. So until this year, they did not have metrics in their scoring system, they're focused on what we'd say family values, right? So now they're scoring bills their based on their idea of Christian morality. Okay. That doesn't normally jive with a libertarian organization, right? You're about freedom and liberty, but once you add that element, you're actually excluding freedom and liberty for a lot of people. And because it's exclusive to a group and you're focused on othering people. So it's like, no, only this narrow view. Okay, they're free to do that. They're a private organization, privately funded, but they have an outsized role on electing people. So they, over the years, have spent so much money, raised and spent money to elect a group of loyal legislators that they could count on for their vote. The problem is, in the process of doing this, they went after the Speaker of the House, who is LDS, and tried to elect someone who is not LDS to run against her and spent, I mean, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was one of the most expensive races in Idaho history, and they failed. They did not take out the speaker. He won his reelection, and he was not happy about this. So he's aligning with a group of what I would say more Christian nationalists have split from the Freedom Foundation, have their own Idaho Freedom Caucus. And you're now seeing this open war. And I mean, it's like a bitter knockout, ugly fight publicly on X, Twitter, and social media, attacking the Freedom Foundation for not being conservative, for not doing what they want. And so it's now we're seeing actually the things I was talking about before, this fight between Christian nationalists and members of the LDS faith, it's happening right before our eyes. But it's weird seeing some of these crossover players. A really good example, right? You had this guy named Matt Shea, who was a legislator in Eastern Washington. Long history of him. If you look him up, there's a lot of Google searches, including a New York Times story about his manifesto that got leaked called The Biblical Basis for War, where in it he gives these and he was very much into dominionist ideology, affiliated with the Barry and Ann Bird's church up there. And they push these ideas like, hey, if you commit adultery, if you do any of these, if you're homosexual, you commit any of these sins, when we get our state of liberty, meaning we have our own government, separatist government, you would be put to death. Okay. That's literally their basis of law that they want to do. And at the end, he says, if they do not submit, kill all the males. Okay. This is his thinking. Now, once again, who is he? Just some weird one guy in Washington, whatever. No, he actually ran an organization called the Coalition of Western States, which included some Idaho legislators like Heather Scott, the one who's trying to bring forth the ban on gay marriage, um, and others who attended the standoff in Moyer run by Ammon Bundy, who claims to be LDS. So this weird partnership between people like Matt Shea and Ammon Bundy, I see as a marriage of convenience. We need people like Bundy because he makes a lot of noise and he draws a crowd and is willing to do something that they might not want to go to jail for, but they want him to start the next civil war, right? And all the reporting, everything else shows is Shea was not only there, he was courting. He was a former Army intelligence officer, et cetera, and a lawyer who actually wanted to start a shooting war. He wanted bullets to fly. He was also present in helping organize the Bundy standoff in Nevada. Same guy, pushing the same thing, working with Bundy. So you do see some interesting things where there are LDS Christian nationalists, right? There has always been this idea, it goes back for years, of members of the LDS faith who believe in this really close-knit relationship between church and government and the idea of taking over government to enforce your ideology. So it's less about which specific sect of Christianity you are and more about the overarching idea of, well, we need to take over government so we can enforce our ideology. But then the question is, what happens when you get power? Whose ideology wins? And we're starting to see that because this group has taken power and now there's the infighting. Well, who's right?
Mhm.
And so that's why a lot of these organizations fail, is because they can't agree. And there's so many outsized egos, a lot of narcissists, et cetera, that they start fighting. And we're seeing that happen in real time. But as a result, the things that need to happen to legislate, to basic government function, right? To keep the lights on, to keep the roads, the trains running on time, whatever you want to say, is like to keep the business of government going to if that affects the everyday lives of everyone. That's getting muddied in these petty culture war fights. And it's a distraction from what needs to happen. And people are getting hurt financially, businesses are getting harmed, bad laws are happening. And as I talked about before, women are suffering financial and physical consequences of these rules.
Hmm. Wow. And so, yeah, these ideas have, you know, have implications,
Mhm.
and so we have to be understanding that, on one hand, as somebody who's been involved in politics myself in the past and was a political consultant and ran for office as well, I understand how, and I also saw all kind of the rise of this movement happening. Um, it's really fascinating. Actually, I'll tell you a story off camera about an incident that I had at the Leadership Institute, which really opened my eyes to what was really going on, and it's really fascinating. So, but yeah, so I kind of got to witness a lot of this stuff happening. You saw the rise of populism with Ross Perot in the 90s and then with Pat Buchanan's campaign. And then interestingly enough, you kind of morphed into something that even Donald Trump was actually opposed to Pat Buchanan. Interestingly enough, in the year
Mhm.
2000, he was thinking of running against him, but
Yep.
essentially, in many ways, is to further to the right than Pat Buchanan ever was. So it's just fascinating to see this transition happening in the Republican Party and in the political landscape. I would have never imagined that it would have gotten to this point, and it has. And for you, just for you as a lifelong Republican, what does it feel like to see this happening to your party?
You know, it it's hard, right? And as if I was just a casual observer, right? I'd be like, this is annoying. This sucks. This is not fun. It would be difficult. And it really comes down to how invested you are in it, right? Many people are casual Republicans. They vote for president. They have no idea who the legislator is. They have no idea who's on the ballot. They just check the R by their name. Okay. That's, I would say, a lot. And groups like this count on it because they're only looking at the margin of like 3%. They just need to influence the 3% of the total voters to win an election. They don't need to influence the majority, just that narrow margin. They know that. It's actually a very clever tactic that's written in a book called Confrontational Politics. It's literally part of their playbook. So you can be aggressive, you can be confrontational, you can be offensive on purpose. That's literally by design. Okay. So, because it's not that hard to get 3% of people who are, I would say, somewhat weak-minded, angry, and believe in what you want. Okay. To believe in conspiracy theories, to believe the misinformation you're feeding them. And that's what they use to win. Now, as a result of that, I called that out. Now, as a Republican, I was helping on some campaigns. It was one race in particular in Madison County, which is Rexburg, where BYU Idaho is. Um, I helped someone who was a son of a former lieutenant governor, Republican, unseat a popular. Actually, he was one of the leaders of the far right, who was also a BYU, who now runs the Freedom Foundation, a former BYU economics professor. And as a result, the people behind him have now spent the last, oh, I'd say 5 years actively trying to destroy my life. And I don't mean that casually, like literally, there were phone calls to my employer to get me fired. I have faced multiple lawsuits that have cost me six figures to fight. I have had death threats. I have had pictures of me and my family posted online of us out to eat at In and Out, published online. Like we can get you anywhere. Um, it's scary, right? Because I spoke up. I'm a Republican. And I have people claiming to be Republicans attacking me because how dare I tell the truth?
Yeah, these are very difficult times that we are living
They
in.
are. So personally, it's hard to answer your question.
Yeah,
It is
that
very hard to watch, but I'm invested. I'm personally invested because of what's happened. That's not everyone's story. That's not typical.
Well, I just wanted to say, folks, just real quick, I just want to remind people to check out the Political Potatoes Substack. He's got the podcast and he's got the his articles that he's written, and check that out and make sure you subscribe to his um, podcast as well, called Political Potatoes. And I really want to thank you so much for coming on the program today. I really have enjoyed our phone call conversations that we've had over the last couple of weeks. So you've really informed me about a lot of got deep in the weeds in Idaho politics, which I wasn't expecting, but it was good for me to kind of get, and you've given me so many resources. And by the way, folks, I'm going to have links in the description to many of the things that he talked about today. He's been emailing me. I'll have all these links in the description and the show notes for you to check out all these resources. There's some really interesting work that you've done. And I think it's really important that we get this out there because this does have an impact for everybody. This is happening nationwide. And I want people to be aware in the LDS community that there are people that are in some ways using you, using your money, using your support, but ultimately will turn against you at some point once they feel that they've reached that's their long-term game right there. So I think it's important to be aware of that because I'm a friend. I'm a friend to I love my homies in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I love the people, and I don't want to see you get hurt. Greg, I'm so sorry what's happened to you, and you've been hurt. And I think it's really important that, lay off going after people's family and kids, folks. I mean, that's ugly. That's horrible that they would do that kind of stuff. If somebody attacked me and my mom, there was an ex-Mormon that attacked my mom. I mean, sickness
Mhm.
that's out there. And it's not just a right-wing thing or a left-wing thing. I mean, it's not just the right wing. It's happening on the left wing too. It's not just, people that are right-wing religious fanatics. It also happens with ex-Mormon fanatics as well. So we have to realize that fanaticism and extremism is confined to one ideological spectrum. It's everywhere. And I think all good people who want to see this country succeed, who want to live in an America that's for everyone, we all need to band together because honestly, there's more of us than there are of them.
I agree.
Well, Greg, I want to thank you so much for coming on the program today. Was there any final words that you wanted to share with the audience?
I would say just pay attention, right? Do your research, read, listen to multiple sides of a conversation argument, and seek the truth.
Mm, amen. Seek the truth. I love that. Okay. Well, folks, again, we'll have links in the description to everything we talked about. Also, we'll have links in the description for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel. Greatly appreciate those who are supporting us. I'm so thankful to have the support that we have here at MBR. Couldn't do it without you. Remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.